This is the Comics Alternative, episode 263. Reviews of Now, number 2, The Strumpet, number 5, and Barbarella, numbers 1 and 2. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Gene, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, Gene and I are going to be discussing 3 recent titles. We're going to begin with the second issue of Now, edited by Eric Reynolds and published by Fantagraphics. After that, we're going to look at The Strumpet, issue 5, edited by Lindner and Glynnis Fawkes. And then we're going to wrap up with Mike Carey and Keenan Yarar's new Barbarella, issues 1 and 2, coming out from Dynamite Entertainment. But before we get into those reviews, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by those wonderful, wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are going to be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some mind-blowing specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price, sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
Yeah, and there's bundles this month. There's about 1 billion different DC Universe bundles of one form or another. DC Universe Vertigo, DC Young Animal, even DC Kids, and all of those except for a variant edition bundle are all at 50% off. There's a Marvel Legacy bundle at 50% off, and even a Valiant bundle at 50% off. So, lots of bundles, lots of 50%s.
That's right. Bundle, bundle, bundle from our good friends at Discount Comic Book Service. Check out their website, dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, bundled or otherwise, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Gene and Derek sent you.
That's right. Comics Alternative everywhere.
That's right. Well, Gene, Happy New Year, and this is the first time you and I are recording in 2018. How are you?
Oh, I'm getting over the flu, so we'll see how this goes.
And you cough there for emphasis, kind of like as the punctuation mark there.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's okay. That's kind of like calling work and going, I'm not feeling well today.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you being a trooper in recording this as you're recovering. So even though it may sound like, you're a little under the weather, you're nonetheless mentally acute enough to discuss these 3 new titles.
Well, let's see how that goes.
Okay, if all of a sudden I hear a thump and there's silence on your end, one, I will call 911 with your address, and second, I will, I guess, wrap up the episode a little sooner than expected.
Okay.
So this first title we are going to be discussing is Now, number 2, and this is the new comics anthology that began last year from Fantagraphics. Eric Reynolds is the editor of this, and Paul Lai and I reviewed issue number 1 back last year. I think it was either October or November. And so now we have this second issue out. Now, Gene, did you read the first Now?
I read some of it. I haven't actually read the entire issue.
Uh-huh. So, from what you read, what was your impression of the Now debut?
Well, what I saw, I liked a lot, and that continued this time as well. It's a really big variety of styles, and there's a longer things, shorter things. It looks like there's no continued stuff from what I can see, which sometimes is an anchor for an anthology, but they're not doing that, it seems like, so far, and that seems to be, and for me, that's a good thing.
Oh, really? So if they had, let's say, one or two stories between, let's say, Now number 1 and Now number 2, that one kind of carried on from the other in number 2, from number 1 to number 2, you wouldn't have liked that as much?
Well, for me, it's a I guess because I'm a kind of a scattershot reader, sort of. So it would be. I mean, I understand the economics behind it. I mean, if you've got a continued thing that makes people want to buy the next issue to read the next chapter of that story, but I guess I'm a little more used to either mini comics or standalone graphic novel type things. And if I want serialized stuff, that's there's the web for that and things. I don't know. I like the fact that I can just pick up any issue of an anthology and just kind of dive in and not worry about where we are in the middle of 12 different things.
Yeah, I mean, I see where you're coming from there. And one of the reasons I was asking is because I know when Paul and I reviewed this first issue of Now back in the fall, one of the things I did was to compare it to Fantagraphics' earlier anthology, Mome. And, I absolutely loved that anthology. I read every issue almost as soon as it came out. And even though I think the majority of the contributions in each issue were standalone, there were some creators who had ongoing storylines between and among various volumes. Again, the majority of the stories or the contributions were one and done standalones, but there were a few that carried over. But you're right to point out that at least so far, with both Now 1 and Now 2, we don't have any serialized narrative.
Yeah, it's just I was expecting it, and so when I didn't see it, personally I was happy, but I was also a little shocked because that seems to be usually how anthologies kind of keep their bread and butter going. But to mix a lot of metaphors.
Yeah, this is interesting in that. It's not as if there are many ongoing anthologies that come out now that are published on a regular basis. And I'm not talking about things like, for example, the annual Best American Comics. That just comes out once a year. And, there are others that maybe other anthologies that are just one and done and that's it. It's a rarity we get a publisher that has an anthology that comes out either every month or every other month or even every quarter. An example of that is the Dark Horse Presents. We don't have that anymore.
Yeah, it was running pretty recently, wasn't it? Has it died again?
Yeah, it came out, and I can't remember how many years ago, maybe about 3 or 4, in a new format, in a new kind of shorter, more affordable format. And, for the life of me, I can't remember when that very last issue, I don't know if it's the very last, but at least the last one we've seen of Dark Horse Presents came out. I know that Fantagraphics has tried in the past to do other anthologies. I think that several years ago there was one that came out. I don't think there was ever an issue number 2 of Insect Bath. But and we reviewed that one on the podcast when it came out. So it's not as if anthologies are that common. So I'm hoping that Now is something that will be around for now. So to speak. But, okay, so now you and I are discussing this second issue of Now. What are your impressions of this collection?
It kind of goes all over the place, which I kind of like in an anthology often. Stylistically, thematically, there's not a lot that holds it together except the fact that it's all generally pretty good. Mm-hmm. But and then there's a good mix of short stuff and much longer stuff. I'm not quite sure what its operating identity is right now. It just seems to be good, kind of a good comics told in maybe in a slightly slanted way. I'm not quite sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that I like about not only this most recent issue of Now, but also the first one as well, is what you mentioned, and that is the variety of style, and not only in terms of art, but style of storytelling. So, for instance, in this issue, we have very different kinds of storytelling strategies. On one end of the spectrum, if you want to look at it this way, we have what you could consider a more conventional kind of storytelling in Joseph Remnant's Photo Case, which is a one-pager, and it is in the very end of this issue. And it tells a fairly straightforward, albeit brief, narrative. I would also put into that category, or more toward the more conventional form of storytelling side of the spectrum, Dash Shaw's Ford. But then on the other hand, you have a style of narrating that is vastly different from your more traditional kind of storytelling. And I'm thinking here in particular of James Turek's Saved, and then Fabio Zimbres, and I'm not sure how you pronounce that name, Zimbres, that longer story that opens, or that almost opens this volume, The Apocalypse According to Dr. Zung.
Right, yeah, the Fabio Zimbres story is it looks very mini comic-y, even though it's about how many pages long is it? It's about 30 pages long. Mm-hmm. But it and even from a presentation, it looks like the original presentation was probably more mini comic sort of thing, and it's this whole it's. There's a lot of nested narrative to it.
Yeah.
I think we should talk about it. It reminds me of a little bit of either Frankenstein, or I don't know if you ever saw the movie, the Saragossa Manuscript. It's like it's this Polish movie from 1965 that it's just people tell stories, and then characters within stories begin to tell stories, and it's really hard to tell where one thing ends and another begins, and by the end of it, you don't really know where you are anymore.
Right.
And this one kind of does that too. Although we've got a prologue and epilogue that kind of wraps the insides.
Yeah, and in fact, the prologue and epilogue are quite unusual. It threw me at first. It begins with the prologue with this guy who is opening a can of something. It looks like he's in his kitchen. And out of the can comes this genie. He says, "I'm the genie of the can, and I grant you 3 wishes." And the guy says, "I want a lot of money, a lot of women, and and a lot of, a lot of wisdom." Yeah, that's it. And then the genie from the can says, "Your wish is my command." Abracadabra. And then there are 3 cans on the table, one with the name of each of his wishes: money, women, and then wisdom. And then all of a sudden we get to the story proper, The Apocalypse According to Mr. Zung. And I have no clue where the hell the title comes from, given what happens from this point on. Not exactly sure who Dr. Zung is, not sure what kind of apocalypse is going on here. But then we get to the epilogue, and we have this same guy who, talked to the can genie. He's opened the can of money. He's opened the can of women. And then at the very end, the can that is left unopened is wisdom. Which, I thought that the prologue and epilogue were pretty understandable, but that story in the middle that makes up The Apocalypse According to Dr. Zung, I really don't know what to make of it. I think you're right. To some extent, I would call this a nested narrative, right? Because you do have a series of stories where something will happen, and then one character will say to someone else, "Oh, this reminds me of," or "this happened to me," or "I couldn't get here in time because," and then they tell a story. The difference, though, between, I guess, a more decipherable kind of nested or framed narrative is that usually with most framed narratives or nested narratives, you pretty much can tell where the story within a story ends and begins. Here, as you pointed out, it's confusing because some character will say something and tell a story of someone else, and then this story becomes the narrative's focus. Then another story is introduced. And so instead of it being a series of framed narratives or nested narratives, you have this sense of narrative tangents, where one story leads to something else, leads to another story, leads to still another story, and you end up completely different from where you started.
Yeah, it's and it's I've got to admit, I'm not entirely sure what the story itself is supposed to mean. Zoig himself, the name Zoig reminds me of Zeugma. I don't know if it's a figure of speech where a word can kind of have two different meanings, or like a word applies to two different senses. So there's kind of like there's a fluidity, I think, that's in his name, sort of, and that's really is that's really what's going on in the narrative, if you can call it a narrative, is very fluid, but it's also very contemporary. I mean, there's a lot of the Reagan and Bush show up a little bit, but there's also like an indictment of capitalism and an indictment of selfishness, and so I think that's one of the reasons why, even though it's from 1990 something, it feels a little more contemporary, even with some of the dated references.
Right.
Thematically, it's talking about how horrible people are in ways that we can recognize today.
Yeah, exactly. It was strange, but in an unusual way, I enjoyed it. It took me a couple readings.
Oh, yeah, me too, definitely.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things I found in this volume of Now is that the first time I read it, I had a better sense of the last half of this volume than I did the first. And I don't know if it just took me a while to get my, so to speak, narrative sea legs with this particular issue, but I didn't appreciate the stories in the first half, but on the first reading. But then I went back to reread it, and I got a better sense of what was going on, and I could, I think, better appreciate and enjoy those first several stories.
Yeah, I didn't get a sense of the book feeling different as it went through necessarily, but
yeah, and I think it was just my sense of reading perspective when I first read it. So I don't know, and I think I did read it in two parts. That when I started reading it, I read about half of it, put it aside, and then the next day picked it up again and read the second half. And so, I don't know, maybe I was in a particular mood that first time that I read the book, or at least the first half. I tell you something that is in this first half of Now number 2 that I did appreciate the first time around, and second, and third even, especially when it comes to the visuals, is Tommy Matsuri's Samuel.
All right, that's one that's just on page 34? The wordless.
Exactly, yes. Now, that's a story that really goes nowhere, but that's not the point of what this comic is about. In other words, its plot takes a back seat. In fact, it probably takes a seat 3 rows back at least, as to what at least I got out of this piece, Samuel. I think it's the art and the visuals and the vibrant colors that really stand out to me. In fact, this is the most visually vivid piece in the entire collection.
Yeah, it's kind of got a balloony, cartoony sort of look to it in some ways. Not exactly Simpsons, not exactly like it's almost like if Duckman were drawn with a clear line style. Mm-hmm. It's a little more like that. But again, I mean, you start off with an explosion, and the naked guy just walks through the remnants of a brick wall for whatever reason around and seeing the kind of walking through the city of these odd creatures, and then basically the next 4 pages are basically just that creature our protagonist going to different environments and looking at things.
Mm-hmm. And that's all he does.
Yeah, and because each of those pages is a six panel grid, and the fifth panel in every one of those last 4 pages is like a close up. It's like suddenly we're watching him in all 5 other panels, just about. But that fifth panel, the penultimate panel on each page, is basically his point of view. And so you get these really kind of cool abstract things kind of anchoring the lower left of each page.
You know, that's a good point, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, because once this title character, Samuel, leaves the point, the wall that explodes, that's when we get this detail that you mentioned. So we first see him on a bridge, and he looks down, and then the fifth panel on page 36, we see a close-up of the water that apparently he sees. Then on that next page, he's walking out in what looks like a field of some sort, and he looks down, and in that fifth panel, we see a close-up of a butterfly on a flower. And then on page 38, when he is in a forested area with a lot of leaves are falling, he looks down, and on that fifth panel, lo and behold, a close-up of a leaf. And then, of course, on that last page, when he sits on a rock in what looks like a bay, he looks out over the sunset. And we do see, as best as we can, I guess, a close-up of the sun as it's setting. So, I do think that this is one of the more visually stunning pieces in the collection. And this is a creator that I've read 1 or 2 of his things before, Mitsuri, but I don't know him that well. Do you know more of his work?
I don't, actually. I would like to now, though.
Yeah, and I can't remember where I first encountered him. I don't know if it was the first issue of Now, but I've seen something of his recently. I just can't remember where. I don't know, maybe it was Best American Comics. I can't remember. But it was another anthology like this. Now, there's some names in this anthology that I do recognize. Joshua Cotter, Sammy Harcum, Dash Shaw, and Joseph Remnant. I mean, all of those people, I know their work. I really enjoy what they do. And in fact, some of them even contributed to the first issue of Now. So I know Harcum did, so did Shaw. So even though we don't have a continuation of storylines from one issue to another, it looks like we may have, kind of like we did with Mome, certain creators that we can count on to contribute, if not every issue of this new anthology, then maybe many different issues of Now.
I recognize most of those names that you recognize as well, but there are people here that I'm not familiar with. Another one that I liked that's kind of in that Samuel style a little bit was Hot Heavy Days.
Yeah,
by In a Creative Crisis by Conxita Herrero, and that one again, it's another. It starts off almost as this wordless comic. It's one of the typical. A typical writerly or cartoonist trope of I don't have any ideas, and so our main character has these white dots that are kind of floating above her head that kind of interact with the environment around her, and it's almost like those are her empty ideas, but people can see them. The wind can blow them away. And the story doesn't really go too many places. But I like a lot how it looks, and the circles tend to hold the pages together in interesting ways for me.
Yeah, and also they link one panel to another in some cases.
Yep.
Yeah. One of the things I liked about this story is the fact that, as you pointed out, the thought bubbles or circles, whatever they are, or creative thoughts, creative images. Are tangible, and so they become a part of her environment. At one point she turns on the fan, and the fan blows those white circles away. In another instance, she walks down the street and meets a couple of friends at a cafe, and one of the friends says, he points to one of the circles and says, "What's that?" And the protagonist says, "I don't know. Been there all day." And then the other friend says, "How strange. Does it hurt?" And she responds, "No, it's just there. Maybe it's the heat." And so I appreciate that. And to me, this story was, I guess, to a certain degree, kind of metafictional in that it's a narrative about the process, I guess, of creation, whether it be, creating a story or just creating something, some kind of art in some way. And I appreciated that. Another similarity between Herrero's art and that we were just discussing, Matsuri, is that their style is rounded, right? I mean, you're dealing with, in many ways, kind of, simple primary colors, but also characters especially tend to be presented rather rounded, right? We don't have any sharp edges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's all kind of a clear line, flat color thing like that as well.
Yeah. The piece that follows Hot Heavy Days, A Perfect Triangle, I have to say that is probably one of my, if not my favorite contributions to this issue of Now. And this is by Ariel López V, or Ariel López V, I guess, because there's a period after the V. What did you think of this story?
It's freaky. It's a little Mark Beyer-esque to a certain extent. And it's weird because the woman who looks to be a protagonist is really like, it's almost like a second person sort of thing, because the narrator is like the secondary character. Mm-hmm. And I like the idea of the triangle as kind of like a symbol, but also it becomes kind of a layout technique, but the layouts can get really varied and funky as you go through. And when you get to the last few pages, it's just like, it's a crazy huge mess. It's like Kaz meets Mary Fleener.
That's good. Yeah, and this is a fun story too, because the title character, and what is her name, Val? Yes,
yeah, I think
Val.
So, yeah.
She's out in her neighborhood one day. She's riding her bike, and she starts looking around the neighborhood. And she notices something. Now, as readers, we don't see what she's noticing, because I'm looking at that page where she realizes something. It's 61. And as she's biking around the neighborhood, she says, "Oh, wow, that's weird. Huh, there it is again." And I remember going back and looking really intently at these images. And on this page, the panels, for the most part, are circular. And thinking, okay, what is she seeing? And we don't know at first. But then she calls up her friend, which, as you point out, is the narrator of this story, also a former boyfriend of Val's. And she tells him that she realizes something. She noticed something that's very curious and maybe a little frightening, and she wants her friend to come see. Basically, what she sees is that there are certain buildings, certain apartments that have a triangle above the door, and she doesn't know what to make of it. So she and her friend go out, and they try to make sense of these triangles, and they don't know what it refers to. Then later on, Val takes out a map of the neighborhood and plots where each of these houses or doorways with triangles above them are. And the pattern that's laid out is of a triangle. And so she thinks that if she goes to the very center of that triangle, location-wise, whatever building is there, that she'll find the answer to her question. And what happens when Val and her friend go to the center, this particular place in the neighborhood, it's rather freaky. I don't want to give anything away, though.
Yeah, it's thematically freaky. It's visually freaky, and I like the visual freaky a whole lot.
Yeah. And by the end of the story, and again, no spoilers, but something happens to where you don't know if Val is of her right mind or not.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure he is either.
Right. Yeah. But I like that kind of ambiguity, and I like the way that the story ends. Now, that's another one of those tales that I think has a more conventional storytelling style, unlike some of the other stories that we've mentioned. The piece that follows that is this issue's contribution from Dash Shaw, and this is Ford. Are you a fan of Dash Shaw's work?
A bit. I like it a bit. It's not. I'm not as bowled over as a lot of people are. I like it a lot, but this one, to me, I'm not sure why we care about this guy. It's kind of strange. I mean, it's pretty straight. It's a pretty straightforward story, but it doesn't seem to do a whole lot for me.
Well, I liked it primarily because of the ending. which just, I don't know, it just seemed to catch me by surprise. And I think that it was a humorous, and for me at least, an unexpected touch to end the story on.
Oh, yeah, that's true. It makes a good bookend with the beginning of the story as well. So that works well, but it makes the character of makes the female character is kind of I don't understand what's up with her.
Yeah,
he's a little messed up. She's apparently really messed up.
Yeah, and basically what this story is about, and we won't give anything away in terms of the ending, because I think that's part of the enjoyment of this particular story, is that we have a main character who is a guy who's moved to, and we don't know exactly where, but it's a place where he needs a car, but he grew up in a place like New York City where he didn't need a car. He doesn't even like cars. And so in terms of meeting women, he wants to, but at the same time, he doesn't want it to seem as if, he's a loser without a car. So he ends up meeting someone somewhere, this woman that we've referenced, and she has a car, and they meet, I don't know, at a bar or a restaurant, and then she asks him if he would mind driving her back to her place. He ends up staying the night, and then they become honest with one another. She says, well, I'm glad you drove me because I've lost my license. She had a drinking problem and she's not going to have her license for a while. And he says, oh, well, I'll be upfront with you. I don't have a car. And so, I know it's almost like an ironic O. Henry-esque twist
it's a little,
to their relationship.
The Ford of the Magi.
Yeah, there you go. That's really good. And then something happens at the very end. She ghosts him, right? So she just quits, calling him, and he doesn't know exactly why. He ends up getting his own car. And then, as you point out, this story kind of ends it as it begins with this, our protagonist on a bike, and then what he experiences in this last scene on his bike is what I was referring to earlier as the humorous, unexpected ending.
Oh yeah, I agree. I agree with that 100%. Yeah, it is. It's funny, but at the same time, it makes me question people's life choices.
Right. Now, the story that follows that by Anuj Shrestha, and I'm probably butchering that name. And this is a short piece, wordless piece, called National Bird. Are you familiar with anything that Shrestha did previously?
No, not at all.
Yeah, same with me. And this is new to me, but I really enjoy the art and what I guess to be the political message going on here.
Yeah, kind of the surveillance society aspect of contemporary life. The art is a little Adrian Tomine-ish, but not exactly.
That's interesting. I now that I look at this, you're right to some degree.
Only a little, though.
Yeah, but I hadn't thought of that before. That's interesting. It does have a kind of really clean look like you find in Tomaini's work. And even some of the characters. So, for instance, I'm looking at the last panel on page 87, and we have a woman who's basically kind of looking out at us as viewers, but what she's seeing is this bird with a surveillance camera as a head that's been flying around. She looks like a character that could be in almost any Tomaini story.
Yeah, and just the kind of the character design, the look on her face, especially the facial expressions for people, and like the kind of the use of color and the spotting blacks as well. It looks very much like him to a certain extent, but again, it looks like a Tomaini story, but it doesn't read like one of his stories.
Right.
Yeah, because it's not about it's not relationship based or whatever. It's more just kind of so it's metaphorical social commentary. But I like the idea of it a lot.
Yeah, I do as well. The story after that by James Turek, Saved. Again, this is another creator that I was unaware of before I read this story. Had you seen anything of Turek's before?
No, it was brand new to me.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting about this, and I guess this functions almost as a subtitle to Saved, and that is a showdown poem, because on the second page we have this armadillo on its back, and in a word balloon, the armadillo is saying a showdown poem. And I don't know, I took that as the subtitle because what we have here is an example of the text and the art not aligning.
Right. It's a little bit like Chris Ware's Thrilling Adventure Stories, or I Guess.
Right, I Guess. Yeah, it's a great example. Yeah. Yeah, and so here we have, and this is, I guess, the poem that the armadillo refers to, the text in this story, and I'm not going to read all of it, but it begins like, remember how you pictured yourself in each job in the help wanted section, how no matter how ill-suited, yoga instructor, vinyl siding installer, plumber's assistant, you'd find a way to sustain until your gravy train came in. And then it continues after that. Now, the images that accompany the text in the panels throughout this story have nothing to do whatsoever with what this, I guess, poem is about. And I'm not even sure what the story is that's being told with the art. I mean, we have characters in some kind of showdown. So if the subtitle of this piece is a showdown poem, the poem or the text itself doesn't seem to have much of anything to do with the showdown, but the visuals have something to do with the showdown.
Yeah, well, the showdown, I think the showdown in the text a little bit is kind of like a kind of confronting aspects of your life. It seems like the text is a little bit about the creative process. There's I think there's a little cartoonist autobio buried deep within the poetry of the words, and the poetry of the images. I'm not entirely sure, because it is, again, like you said, it looks like it's not a Wild West showdown. It's like a burned out subdivision showdown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a little unusual. I liked it. Yeah,
it has a little like a alternative Japanese feel to it, also a little bit. Mm-hmm. Just with the because it's printed to look as if it's on kind of rough paper, and the rough. The kind of like the stipple backgrounds and stuff like that.
You know, that's interesting. You're right. This does have the feel of something like you may find in Gatto.
Like, that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah,
exactly.
the alternative manga publication from years back.
Yeah, that's exactly what was in my head.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite pieces is toward the very end of this, and this is by Joseph Remnant. And, Remnant just last year came out with Cartoon Clouds, which was a phenomenal book, one of my favorites from 2017. And I even had the pleasure of talking with Joseph on the podcast. And I like this. This is, in many ways, kind of, well, it's a one-pager photo case, but it's a dense story, and I think primarily because there's a lot of text. In every single panel, and we have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, we have 12 panels on just one page, and so it is very tightly packed. And in each panel, we have quite a number of words. And basically, this is a story about, and I assume this to be, if not autobiographical, then maybe faux autobiographical, of someone, I guess, Joseph Remnant, who is at the sale of someone's estate, someone who had been a hoarder. He comes across this case. He's really taken by the case. He opens it up, and there are these incredible, phenomenal photographs in the case. And he also finds a journal. And in the journal, we find it's the photographer, the woman who had taken the pictures, who tells the story in her journal, at least some of her story, because he doesn't get everything about what happened or why she's doing what she's doing, who feels impelled to take certain photographs and feels that it is like a mission that God gives her. And it just kind of ends, the story in the journal. And then the narrator has to decide what to do with these photographs because they seem very special.
Yeah, I don't know if, are you familiar with Vivian Maier?
No, I'm not.
This is how do you explain Vivian Maier? Basically, she's become a cause celeb among photography, and her work was she took photos for decades. She worked as basically governesses. She was Phil Donahue's governess for a while.
Really?
Yeah, and somebody bought trunks full of her photos, developed and undeveloped, in an estate sale somewhere, and her stuff had almost never been published anywhere ever. And there's been a documentary about her. There's been several books, and there's also two different people who kind of claim to have rights to her stuff. So this really, the photo case really looks to me as if it's like an alternative take on the Vivian Maier story.
Huh, it's interesting. I just looked it up, and I see on Google all of these hits now, even a website of her stuff, vivianmaier.com.
Yeah, it's her stuff is just amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And if she was active in the 50s and 60s, especially around Chicago. But and she did a lot of self-portraits also, and the self-portrait plays a role in photo case as well. But her self-portraits are always kind of like obscured and things like that.
Huh. Yeah, and in fact, that last panel is, I guess, the one self-portrait that the narrator says had been in that collection. So you think that Remnant is basically taking off of the Vivian Maier phenomena?
It's what it feels like. I mean, it could very well be straightforward, but straightforward something that actually happened to him. But it has a lot of resonances with the Vivian Maier story, because we don't really know why a lot of things happened and why she was so good, and why she stopped and things like that. So, but I mean, I like it independent of that. But knowing being a fan of Vivian Maier just kind of gave me an extra bit of resonance there.
Yeah, huh. But I do definitely like this one-page story by Remnant. Whether or not it refers even indirectly to Vivian Maier or not. Yeah, it's great. And I think this is another great issue of Now. I'm looking forward to when issue 3 comes out, which I believe is sometime in late March.
Cool, yeah, I'll be looking for that.
Okay, Gene, you want to move on to the second title that we're discussing this week?
Yeah, let me just bring that up here. Our second title is The Strumpet, issue number 5.
Mm-hmm. And this is edited by Ellen Lindner and Glynnis Fawkes. And we've discussed Glynnis Fawkes on the podcast before. This was kickstarted last year successfully, which is how I discovered it. And So I just, I don't know, about a month or so ago, got my issue that I kickstarted of the Strumpet number 5. But I also learned that the previous 4 issues, Strumpet 1 through 4, had also been kickstarted. Now, you were familiar with the Strumpet before this latest issue, right?
Yeah, I've been familiar with Ellen Lindner and her work for a while. And a couple of years ago, when I was at Mocha Fest in New York, I actually wound up being across the aisle. The table that I was at was across the aisle from Ellen and Glynnis and some of the other strumpeteers or strumpets or however they refer to themselves. But I picked up some issues there, and. Yeah, it's when I said what I liked. One of the things I liked about Now was that there was kind of like no connecting thread. It was just good comics. This one has a very clear connecting thread because this is their origin stories issue. But and everybody takes that, and so there is a very clear connecting thematic thread. But a lot of people approach that origin story thing kind of from a slant also. So there's a lot of autobio, but it's pretty much all autobio, except for one story kind of felt like it is a little more allegorical possibly. But it's really focused not just on something that happened in my life, but something that was really kind of life-changing or setting you off on a path or something like that. And that I like that a lot because I thought that thread connected really well throughout the stories.
Yeah. Now, I know that with the previous issue, number 4, that also had a theme to it, which was friendship. And actually, I got issue number 4 when I backed the Kickstarter project, because the level that I backed it for, I got not only Strumpet number 5, the latest, but I could choose another issue, so I chose the previous one, number 4. So that deals with friendship. I don't know if the first 3 issues of the Strumpet had a particular theme.
I think they all did.
Okay.
If I'm not mistaken.
I didn't see it on Kickstarter because you can still see their original Kickstarter pages and the information surrounding that, but I didn't see a particular theme. Now, this is a transatlantic anthology, so we have a number of creators, let's say from the UK, but we also have a number of US female creators as well. I know that with the first issue, because I was watching the video right before we started recording of the Kickstarter for that first issue of the Strumpet, and Ellen Lindner was referring to the Whores of Mensa, and apparently this is a collection of female creators who basically founded, from what I can gather, the Strumpet. Maybe now they call themselves, as you pointed out, Strumpets. I don't know. But, yeah, all the creators in this anthology are women, or at least not men who identify as men. Let's just say that. Because we also have, a few contributions here by trans creators that deal with the topic of trans. And trans identity, and as you point out, the theme is origin stories. I like that thematic linkage among all of the contributions in this issue. Another thing I like about it is that it's origin stories in the broadest sense, right? So all of the contributions have something to do with an origin in one form or another, but it's not just, where I came from or where my family hails from or how I became who I am right now. I mean, they do as a whole broadly define origin. And so I think that the editors, Lindner and Fawkes, do a great job of pulling all of these together. But yeah, every single one of these stories has something to do with a beginning of some sort, an origin.
Yeah, and it's a great mix of things. I'd actually read one of the pieces before, Creota Wilberg's The Wandering Uterus and Contemporary Applications of Ancient Medical Wisdom. Like in Creota, I've got that as a mini comic. I buy all of Creota's mini comics. She's the Again, she studies medicine, and she's a cartoonist, and she studies sewing and things like that. But her comics always have something to do with something about the strange takes on either medical history or medical procedures or parts of the body or things like this. And since this one is also kind of deeply ingrained, at least to a certain extent, into medieval ideas of the wandering uterus, since I'm a lapsed medievalist, I was really interested in that also.
You know, I'm glad that you mentioned that story by Creota Wilberg. I mean, I enjoyed all the contributions in this issue of The Strumpet. That, though, really stood out to me for its sense of humor.
Yeah, her stuff is really. She's got one mini comic that's like scenes from James Bond movies where Bond has his flesh removed. There's lots of, but yeah, there's a definite sense of humor to everything that she does. But you're also learning stuff along the way. I mean, in the mini comic, there are footnotes to all this stuff. Also, I mean, there's some footnotes throughout the story. I mean, she goes back to ancient Egypt. She goes to Plato. She's looking at the French, France in the 16th century. But she'll have even more information in the back of there as well. And she's always tying the way the body is talked about into different aspects in different ways. But yeah, and there's always a good bit of humor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really enjoyed that. I wasn't familiar with her work before this. And in fact, the vast majority of the contributors in this issue of The Strumpet are individuals I didn't know about. So I'm really thankful to discover them. I mean, although there are some names that I'm familiar with their works. You know, the aforementioned Glynnis Fawkes, you know, Jennifer Hayden, of course, and one of my favorites, Miss Lesko Gross. Other than that, though, I think those are the only people whose work I knew. I didn't even know Ellen Lindner's work before this.
Yeah, I've known her work for a while. I'm trying to see if there's anybody else, because, Miss Lesko Gross, again, I've known for a long time in Creota. Other than that, most of the other people are pretty much new to me also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that that's one of the great things about anthologies like this, and also now, is that, you know, not only do you have the inclusions of names that may be more recognizable to readers than others. I mean, for instance, in this issue of The Strumpet, people probably will recognize Jennifer Hayden just because of, you know, from a couple of years ago, her really important book, The Story of My Tits. Which I thought was phenomenal, and even the work that Miss Lesko Gross has done with not only Fantagraphics but also Z2 Comics. Again, she's someone who's been around for a while. But some of these others, like for instance Rosie Wilson or Lisa Woolrim, Blom, and I butchered that last name. It's SJO_BLOM. And her story is Paper Lives. I wasn't familiar with her work before, but I was really taken by that story, Paper Lives.
No, I didn't know her work. I didn't know that story at all of manufactured orphans.
Yeah.
That was just absolutely, I mean, and her style is, I think it's not wrong to say that her style is fairly cute. Everything is fairly rounded and stuff like that. But the story that she's telling about children who were taken away from their parents because there were orphanages that needed orphans to sell on to other people is just frightening.
Yeah.
So sad.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned the art and the story message, and I think that's one of the things that's so striking about Paper Lives is the fact that the art is, you know, literally kind of soft and rounded, but the message that is coming from this narrative is the complete opposite.
Right, yeah. But when children from Korea are manufactured as orphans, they are given a document that permanently disrupts their family ties. The new family register is set up for them, officially stating that the child is the only member of the family and that there is no record of any relatives. Ancestricide by the stroke of a pen.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, that was really moving. What other stories in this issue of The Strumpet really stood out to you?
Let's see. Jennifer Hayden's Dear Deathless was really interesting. I mean, again, she's a name that we know a lot, but talking about this kind of weird coincidence between a drawing that was on the wall of the house where she grew up and a somewhat forgotten piece of comics history that Trina Robbins covers in one of her latest books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really enjoyed that one as well, which has me wanting to actually read Pretty in Pink.
I've got it, and I've glanced through it, but I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing.
Same thing with me, yeah. And that came out several years ago. I got a copy, I looked through it, but I didn't read it in a conscientious way from cover to cover, which I should. Go ahead. No, guys, I was going to say, one that I really liked is Rosie Wilson's Origins of You. And I believe this starts on... what is it, page 44, I think it is. And basically what you have is a story of, the creator, Rosie, who seems to be writing this for her child. And so we get the story of Rosie when she was younger, growing up, eventually becoming pregnant from a boyfriend, and then deciding to keep the baby.
Yeah, and I thought this one was very bold and brave too, because it seems like it was written while she's still pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm currently 19 weeks along, and although it's still things aren't perfect by any means, we're both working on it, and so it's like this is like she's writing a story to her unborn child and putting everything out there.
Right. Yeah. In fact, that very last panel of the story is an image of the fetus inside of her tummy, so to speak. Yeah, I really like that. And I think another thing that Wilson really puts out there is the fact that she admits more than once in this story that she has issues mentally and probably shouldn't be a mother, but she nonetheless decides to do so. And I think, admitting that kind of health issue, I think, is quite bold.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's not that she shouldn't be a mother, but she's clearly not ready for it.
Yeah, okay, that's a better way of putting it.
Yeah, but again, I mean, who is anybody ever really totally ready for it?
I can tell you no. Being a parent, no. So there's that. Another story that I particularly liked, and this is, I guess, we can call this the very first story, if we don't count Glynnis Fawkes' cover illustration as a contribution, and that is Patrice Agg's Vacation.
Right,
And this is one of those stories that deals with origins in a very different way that you would normally think. So this is like the origin of, I don't know, like racism or an awareness of difference.
An awareness of difference, an awareness of racism being directed at you, and you're too young to really understand what the problem is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So here you have an African American family, and they're about to go on vacation, and where they're going? Is it Alabama that they're going?
Yeah, they're going to Alabama. It won't be like going to boring old Canada.
Yeah, it's rather interesting. I guess they're going to visit family. That they're going to Alabama, but before they leave, this is where they experience the racism, right? Because there is. What is it? Is this an ice cream man whose truck is coming through the neighborhood, and he makes a comment to them, and he calls them pickaninnies?
Yeah, no, he's a parking lot attendant.
Oh, he's a parking lot attendant. Okay, why did I think he was an ice cream man?
There's a panel that looks like.
Oh, I see. Yes, yeah. On page 4. Yeah, and also. I just finished reading the very first issue of Will Prince and Martine Mazzaro's Ice Cream Man.
Okay.
So maybe that was in my mind. I have no idea. But Okay, so a parking lot attendant. But yeah, they do experience racism, and they don't know what to do with it. Although the older sibling knows, apparently he's experienced something like this, because in this last panel, his young sister is unsure why they were told what they were told, why they were called the names that they were, and she's asking why, and her older brother says, "You haven't figured out much, have you?" And she responds, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Just wait till you get to Alabama." And she asks why, and her brother responds, "Let's just say it won't be like, quote, boring old Canada, unquote. If we're lucky, it'll just be a vacation."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's and that's signified earlier on as well, because when the father's looking for the Green Book, because they're organizing things, and one of the things is the Negro Motors Green Book, which was which I had only learned about maybe 5 or 10 years ago of what the Green Book actually was, but it was the list of places that would be safe for black families to stop when they're traveling in the South. If you're which restaurants are okay, which hotels are, which motels are okay, things like that. Mm-hmm. And so for her, it was just another item to try to move around and they're trying to play a memory game. So for her, it's just this thing. But the dad is looking for it. The parents know. The parents are planning for things, but she's too young to understand any of that yet.
Right. Another story that I particularly liked was Bishop Soames' Trans Femme Hex Witch. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is one of those stories that does deal with trans identity and, I guess, coming into an awareness of who you are and still not being able to pinpoint exactly how you would define yourself. But that's the point of this, right? So instead of trying to describe yourself or to frame yourself in terms of not only, let's say, more traditional gender stereotypes, but even in alternate ways, the creator here seems to be very comfortable with defining, I guess, herself by not defining herself.
Yeah, and she tries for a while with people. She's working with the pronouns as well. Mm-hmm. She mentions talking about trying to get people to use they. And I'll say they try to get people to use they, and they get so frustrated that they becomes she, just so that it will be easier for her.
Right.
And that's a painful part to read, because it's like she's trying to assert a sort of identity, and it's not being accepted. Just linguistically, and it's so the language and the sense of self are really closely tied together. And she's like, well, if that's what there's going to be, well, then I'm just going to go super femme and do that way instead.
Right.
But it's almost like it's not entirely her decision. It's because people around her were having a hard time dealing with what she thought she was at the time.
Right.
So again, this is another one of those really brave things where it's like putting everything out there.
Yeah, but the people that she's frustrated with, who have a hard time, either consciously or otherwise resisting the they, really they're not to blame either. It's the language, right? Because in English we do not have a neuter pronoun.
Right.
Other languages do, like German, they have that, but we don't. So it's either he or she. And they grammatically is incorrect because it's plural. So why would you – we've always been taught you do not refer to a singular by using a plural, even if you don't want to pinpoint it in terms of a gender. It's just grammatically incorrect. And so speakers of English are at a loss. We don't have the language to wrap our brain around or to describe a particular reality. And so to me, it's more of a limitation of language than it is of the community around her.
Yeah, well, it seems like the people that she's dealing with she's talking about friends and things like this, but it's not like these are outsiders as well, so it makes it even harder for her, because she's hoping these people can grasp this concept. And there are the rules of English, but at the same time, if somebody says "this is me," you try to honor that. But again, there's a lot of reasons why, like you said, it's hard for people to do that. But if they could have, perhaps the trajectory of their life would be different at this point.
Exactly. And, language is a habit just like other things are, right? So even if you are aware of what you should call someone by their own wishes, if you've lived your entire life with certain grammatical rules and, what you should say or what you shouldn't say, what's correct, what's incorrect, it's not easy to give that up. Just like it's not easy to give up a particular accent or dialect.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Now, earlier when we first began discussing the Strumpet number 5, you mentioned that these various origin stories, for the most part are autobiographical or deal with life stories in one form or another, except for, I think there was one in particular that you mentioned that you had in mind that was more allegorical, and I'm curious which one you were referring to.
Well, for me, that one, it's not even allegorical. Well, I guess it is allegorical. It's Miss Lascaux Gross's Orange Privilege.
That's what I thought you were going to say, yes.
Yeah, which is basically the origin story of Donald Trump, told as a literal fairy tale of entitlement.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful, and her style here looks almost reads like a Perry Bible Fellowship strip, but it's just so it's super clever. I was not expecting the end at all. I'm glad I didn't scan the page before I started reading, because I was like, this is very different. We got a wizard climbing a mountain with these other people. What's going on? And then you realize, it's Donald Trump's origin story.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that. That is the most overtly political story in this collection. I mean, I think that the vast majority of these pieces are political, broadly defined. But this is, Miss Lascaux Gross's piece is the most, I guess, tangibly anchored in the current political moment.
Although Ellen Lindner's piece directly before it, the story of her first tattoo and kind of embracing her identity as a New Yorker, is tied totally into the fact of Donald Trump being a New Yorker as well. That's right. Even though he's never mentioned by name.
Yeah, you know who they're referring to there in the last couple of pages.
Yeah, even at the very beginning, the first page as well is about that. Without realizing it at first, I cut that on the second go through. So yeah, it's extra Trumpy, even though it seems to be about everything, things other than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other stories in this anthology, the Strumpet number 5, that you want to mention before we move on to the last title?
Okay, just real briefly on page 34. It's a one-page story by Jenny Goldstick called On a Bagel. Mm-hmm. And it's very stylistically different than anything else that's in this book. And again, one of the things I like about this book is that, much like now, maybe even more so, there's such a huge variety of styles. Mm-hmm. And this one is kind of very diagrammatic, and basically, this is like the origin story of a moment in time of somebody ordering a bagel. But it starts it starts with a big bang and goes through very. It's not exactly Chris Ware. It's not exactly anything else. It's kind of textbooky. There's a little of like the Voyager diagrams. But it's just really, really cool and iconographic. Go from 15 billion BCE. 1 million BCE, 1890, 1980, and 2017, moving through moments. Mm-hmm. I just again, it's kind of it's cosmic, and it's also really light and fun, and that moves us directly into the two Trump pieces. So it's like we're kind of moving on a big ride as you go through this book.
Right. Yeah, I enjoyed that one pager as well. One of the things I appreciate about this issue of the Strumpet is at the very end we do have a list of the various contributors and a little bio. And, I have to say that's something that now is lacking You know, on this episode, we're looking at 2 anthologies, and usually in anthologies, you do get brief bios of the various contributors, and that's one of the things I found conspicuously absent from now, but I'm glad that this issue of Strumpet has it.
Yeah, I noticed that in Eric Reynolds' introduction to Now, he's like, he actually says why they don't. Anyone can type any contributor's name into an internet search engine. Effective research, they work more quickly than one could transcribe any specific URLs we might include herein. Trying to write a little like Chris Ware. We effusively encourage further discovery in your own terms and envy the rewards that await you. And yeah, I will. If I see something that's interesting, I will look it up and try to see if I can find out more about somebody. But it is nice, like you said, I really do appreciate being able to just read a story, flip to the back, and immediately see who this is, what other things they've done, where I might want to take a look at them.
You know, I'm glad that you mentioned that short piece by editor Eric Reynolds at the very beginning of Now. You're right, he does mention that, and to a point I can see his argument that we don't really need a bio page or 2 because you can easily look these people up. On the other hand, that assumes that as you're reading the book, you have some kind of computing device and an internet connection readily at hand, and that's not always the case. And also, even if, let's say, you're home and you have your computer, do I want to get up and go to my computer and look this up when I could easily just, let's say, flip to the very end and see those bios like we have in the Strumpet? So, yeah, the internet and the ease and availability of this information does, to a certain degree, I guess, mitigate the need for a biography page in anthologies. On the other hand, it is pretty damn handy to have.
Yeah, definitely. I very much appreciate having the information in the book itself.
Well, you want to move on to the final title that we're discussing this week.
Right, the new incarnation of Barbarella.
Right. And I don't know, there are a couple of places that we can begin here. Oh, and by the way, this is written by Mike Carey with art by Keenan Yarar. I guess that's how you pronounce his last name, Yarar. And this comes out from Dynamite Entertainment. The first issue was released in December of 2017, last month, and issue number 2 just came out now in January. But a couple of places we can begin here is we could begin by contextualizing this with the original Barbarella, or, and maybe this may be even more interesting, we can begin by addressing a question that you expressed to me when I recommended Barbarella, and that is, why is there another Barbarella? Or you said that in so many words. Is there a need for something like this?
Yeah, and I mean, and on the one hand, the answer is very obvious. It's a known name, it's a known quantity, it's a known trademark. Keep the trademark going. There's name brand recognition. If somebody has heard of Barbarella before, they'll be possibly interested in something like this again. Also, Barbarella is cheesecake, and cheesecake sells. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no denying that is part of the appeal of Barbarella. So
exactly.
I guess that's. I'm sure that's why the book exists.
Yeah,
at least on some level.
Yeah, I think to some degree you're right. On the other hand, when it comes to Dynamite Entertainment, I mean, basically their bread and butter is coming out with titles that are either licensed properties or are bringing back older characters to a more contemporary audience. You know, great examples of that would be in terms of licensed property and older characters. You know, Green Hornet, The Spirit, James Bond, Betty Page. A few months ago, they started a series devoted to Betty Page, speaking of cheesecake. You know, and the list goes on and on. I mean, you know, Vampirella, they do the Vampirella stuff. So I think this is just the most recent incarnation of this business model, right? So it doesn't surprise me, because right before, I think, Barbarella, they came out, if I'm not mistaken, with a new Sheena. So why not Barbarella, right? And one thing that Sheena and Barbarella have in common is the sex appeal, right? The cheesecakiness, although I think with Barbarella, there is a more overt eroticism that we have, definitely with the original, but I think even in these first two issues of Carey and Urar's Barbarella, to me, this comes out most strikingly in two places in the first issue. One, when toward the very beginning, we learn that Barbarella, she's captured by a world called people on a world called Perosia, and this is a world that is very warlike and apparently is at current conflict with Earth, but they're also very religious, and so they couch all of their aggression spiritually or through their religious beliefs. They find out that she is, what do they call it? Oh, she has bio-contraband. She's a bio-smuggler. And basically what makes her a bio-smuggler is that she has a vagina. Because the Perosians have basically removed the genitalia of their race through some process that uses a device called the body loom. And what that is supposed to do in a good, I guess, religiously fundamental way is it removes the temptation for lust and whatnot, and they can devote themselves to their higher calling, right? So she's found to have this kind of biohazard, in other words, or biocontraband, a vagina, and she is taken through the body loom. And so, I mean, there's that part in the first issue that deals with the eroticism. But then when she's put in prison, she makes the acquaintance of someone, an Earthling. At first, we're introduced to her as Quire, Quire, but then later on, she tells Barbarella that her real name, or she can be called Jury. And it's spelled just like, I guess, a courtroom jury. And there's one scene where Barbarella and Jury, as well as other women in the prison, through Barbarella's encouragement, are I guess, engage in pleasure, let's just say. Right. And so basically you have what some readers will say, hey, cool, girl-on-girl action. Which is interesting, discussing this issue, the issue number 1 of Barbarella, right after discussing the Strumpet number 5. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Totally different. But yeah. I don't think this is what I had wondered about this new incarnation of Barbarella. I wondered if Carey, as the writer, would take this, let's say, the eroticism a little too far. And so far with the first 2 issues, I really don't see it. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, it's there. It's not a ton. It's not like 23 pages of that.
Right.
So there's a like you said, there's a major science fiction setting and tropes and things like that. I did reread the original Barbarella a little while ago also. And what's interesting to me is that this Barbarella is a lot more. She's more of a protagonist. Mm-hmm. The original is a little more like kind of a Little Annie Fanny or Young Goodman Beaver or
Phoebe Zeitgeist
or Phoebe Zeitgeist. Yeah. Where her body is an excuse for things to happen. She's got a little more. There's a little more, at least, potential agency to her character this time, which I guess you could call character development, or you could say it's not really Barbarella. I'm not sure. Mm-hmm.
Or it's a new interpretation of Forrest's Barbarella.
Yeah, I mean, the art style isn't trying to look like the original at all. The original is very kind of a loose and sketchy, whereas this is I guess maybe a tighter sketchiness, but it's a much more cleaner and up to date art style.
Yeah,
a little more not exactly realistic, but not as kind of like a scratched off as the original Barbarella was.
Right. Yeah, and I have to say I wasn't familiar with the art of Keenan Urar, and I looked him up, and from what I've seen, he hasn't really done that much. I mean, in addition to, of course, Barbarella, he's done a couple of other titles. But I don't know how. I don't think it's that extensive. I know he's done some illustration work for Vampirella, and also a title that I'm not familiar with, The Sovereigns. Well, Urar's art reminds me somewhat of Frank Quitely. Do you see that?
A little bit.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, not exactly, but it just reminded me a little bit of this because there's something. I don't want to say a little cute about it, but a little precise. I know for some reason, precise is a word that comes to mind when I look at Urar's art.
Yeah, I mean it's scratchy and precise at the same time. That things are very deliberately shaped and things like that. I mean, it doesn't. It looks like somebody who has a lot of drawing experience. I mean, if you're saying that he hasn't. If they haven't done a lot of comics yet, it looks. I mean, for what it is, it's very accomplished.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
It doesn't look like something that somebody's just learning their craft or anything like that.
Right. Yeah, I think the art, Urar's art, is a big selling point of this title. But along with that, I do have to say that Carey's storytelling is very solid, at least in these first two issues. I mean, I'm a big fan of Mike Carey's work. I love the original Lucifer series. I really enjoyed the Unwritten. He's done work with Hellblazer, and then a more recent title of his, Suicide Risk. But I think that the story here, and I think largely because of something that you mentioned, is that we have a Barbarella here who is much more a mover and a shaker, someone who has agency, someone who, actually has a cause.
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, I want to blow that way out of proportion, but yeah, she's not merely acted upon.
And one of the reasons why I said she has a cause, I got this most strongly at the end of the second issue. And I don't want to give away any spoilers here, but, as I mentioned, she befriends this woman named Jury. We learned that Jury is kind of an earthling that is undercover, that is trying to find out information about what the Perosians are up to. And she's part of a cell. Now, her cell has been annihilated except for her. But in the second issue, Jury and Barbarella meet up with another earthling from a different cell, someone whose name is Pendrum. And Pendrum doesn't seem to be, let's say, as an admirable a character as his colleague Jury is.
Right.
And it's what Barbarella says to Jury in the last part of that issue that does become something like a cause. That
right,
she's someone
true.
who is humane. So that's where I was basing my comment on.
Yeah, no, I totally see that.
Yeah. I like this, and I liked Barbarella better than I thought I would.
Yeah, I think I would agree. There's a interesting wider world being set up.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a little curious to see where it goes from here. We've got that the end of this issue sets up a couple interesting things also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
to see how they move on from there. But also we've got there are alliances and switches and a little talking critter also, who I'm guessing might become a little more important. Yeah,
the creature's called a Vix, Vix, and it looks like a strange puppy, a puppy-fox combination of some sort. And it's one who has a very limited ability to speak, kind of like a parrot. But it will only repeat what other people have said. And I don't know, to me, this creature, the Vix, strikes me as more of comic relief than anything, but maybe more will be made of the Vix in issues to come. Another character that we're introduced to toward the end of this second issue is a robot by the name of Kettlesmith. Mm-hmm. And there is, again, toward the end of this issue, a 2-page, I don't know if you want to call it an origin story, but it's somewhat like that, of Kettlesmith as he is telling Barbarella how he came to be associated with this Earthling Pendrum. He was a veterinarian, and because so much time, 2 pages, is spent on this robot Kettlesmith, I'm assuming that more will be made of him in issues to come. He'll have a larger role to play.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And so this seems really interesting. I really like this. Now, do you think that you will go on to read future issues of Barbarella?
I might check out when the first arc is collected to see how it all ties up.
Mm-hmm. So you'll just wait for the trade?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And, who knows? I mean, this may be something that's limited to just one trade collection, maybe 2, or it could be something, if it's successful enough, that will be ongoing. Another previous property recreated by Dynamite that takes on a life of its own.
Yeah, like you said, that does seem to be their stock and trade on this sort of stuff, so it does make sense for this book to be published through them.
Yeah. I said earlier that the eroticism surrounding Barbarella is rather limited, especially in that first issue, to maybe a couple of different scenes. Although, just flipping through both issues 1 and 2 now, I do see that there are instances of ample cleavage.
Well, yeah.
And not only from Barbarella. So there's that. So if that offends you, just know that going into this, or if you're someone who privileges eye candy, then definitely this is something you should pick up. Well, Gene, we looked at 3 very interesting and, to certain degrees, quite different titles for this week. We started off with Now, number 2, and this is edited by Eric Reynolds, coming out from Fantagraphics. After that, we looked at another anthology, Ellen Lindner and Glynnis Fawkes' The Strumpet, number 5. And then we looked at the first 2 issues of Barbarella, written by Mike Carey with art by Keenan Urar, coming out from Dynamite Entertainment.
Yeah, a pretty diverse mix of stuff this time.
That's right. If you want to check out great comics like the kind that Gene and I discussed this week, definitely check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there you will find a ton of discounts every single month. January is no exception. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you could leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. Or you can email us. We're 2 guys at comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And Gene, how can people get in touch with you?
I am Gene at comicsalternative.com.
Neat how that works. You can also find us all over social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and our Slack channel. Please join up on that. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. We're all over the place, Gene.
We are all up in your interwebs.
That's right. And we like being there. Can be uncomfortable at times, but hey, there's that. Well, Gene, I hope you get rid of this flu and you're back to your old machine self.
Thank you very much.
You're still doing your comics, right?
Yeah, I've slowed down a little bit, but yeah, we're going to be there's more in the pipeline.
Okay. And for our listeners who maybe haven't had the pleasure of seeing your work before, where can they go to find out about your art and even buy some of your comics?
If you go to comicsmachine.tumblr.com, that's the Tumblr. I haven't updated that in a little while, but there's stuff there, and there are links to the store. I've got T-shirts and a few books for sale and things like that as well. And hopefully soon I will get the soundtrack up to my new book as well. That's right, yeah. Didn't you say that Brian Cremens is working with you on that? Yeah. Brian Cremens and Allison Fellis recorded a soundtrack to it, so you'll be able to buy a book and record set of an abstract comic book, along with songs that pretend to tell you what the book is about, but really don't at all.
Yeah,
but it's a lot of fun.
Well, definitely let me know when that becomes available, and we can put up links on the Comics Alternative blog.
That would be sweet. Thank you.
That'd be great. Yeah, and you should definitely check out Gene's Tumblr page, as he had mentioned. So something worth checking out. Until later, I'm Derek.
Now I'm Gene.
Take care.